Middle-earth holds more than mountains and rivers. It carries the echoes of forgotten ages. I am your keeper of ancient knowledge, sharing the deeper lore that illuminates even the darkest mysteries. Welcome to the Untold Stories.
The Poisoned Wells of Isengard, a tale of the Third Age. Section 1. Shadowed Beginnings. In the days when the White Council yet held discourse beneath the golden eaves of Rivendell, there came a darkening to the southern reaches of the misty mountains that troubled even the Eldar. It was not the sudden darkness of storm cloud, but a creeping blight that seeped from the very bones of the earth, as if some ancient wound had begun to fester anew. The first to mark this change were the eagles of the high peaks. Gwaihir the Windlord brought word of waters that ran black beneath the moon, and of a silence that had fallen upon the vale of Nan Curinir, where once the river Isen sang clear and cold. The tower of Orthanc stood yet unmarked by treachery, its black stone gleaming like a spear point thrust up from the green circle of Isengard. But the rangers who rode the borders of Rohan marked how horses would no longer drink freely from certain streams. The beasts would approach with ears laid back, then turn away with soft wickers of unease. Saruman the White dwelt there still, master of the tower and keeper of its keys. When rangers brought tales of withered grass and sickened sheep, the White Wizard would listen with grave attention and speak learned words of land sickness. Yet always he counseled patience, saying such things came and went with the turning of seasons. But others walked the wild lands with eyes unclouded. The Entwives had vanished long ages past, yet their husbands remembered still the speech of growing things. In rustling leaves, they heard whispers of deep roots drinking poison, of springs bubbling bitter from chambers far below the sight of sun. Treebeard, oldest of his kindred, would stand for hours beside Fangorn's borders, his great beard stirring in winds that carried no refreshment. When seasons turned and young shoots should have burst forth with spring's green fire, instead came a yellowing, a wrongness that crept from south to north. In the depths of night, those few who dared walk Isengard's borders spoke in hushed tones of sounds echoing from beneath the earth. Not the honest ring of hammer on anvil, but something else. A rhythmic grinding, as of vast millstones crushing bone to powder, or the slow breathing of something with no rightful place among wholesome things. The wells were poisoned, though none yet knew it. The shadow was stirring, though its shape remained hidden. Section 2. A Whisper in the Trees. The memory of trees is long, longer than the brief flames of mortal years, longer even than the measured centuries that elves count as seasons. In the deepest heart of Fangorn Forest, where the paths wound between trunks that had stood before the first rising of the sun, the shepherds of the trees held counsel in voices like the creaking of ancient boughs. Treebeard's feet were rooted deep in loam that remembered the music of creation, and in that hour his thoughts moved slow as the turning of seasons. Whom, came his voice like wind through leaves. There is a haste in the growing of things that should not grow, and a dying in what should live long. The roots whisper of waters turned bitter, of earth that rejects the seeds of elm and ash. Quick beams swayed restlessly, his younger wood still feeling the quick fire of sap that flowed like the heartbeat of spring. The borders grow thin, he rustled. Something walks that should not walk. Something delves that should stay buried. The stones of the ancient circle cry out in their sleep. From the southern edges of the forest came others of their kind. Leaflock, moving like the memory of autumn. Skinbark, his hide scarred by fires that burned in the elder days. And Bregalad, whose name meant swift-foot in the tongue of the elves, though his swiftness was measured in the patient years of oak and beech. They spoke in the old Entish, the long language that shaped the world with every syllable, and their words were of root rot spreading like plague through the clean earth, of streams that once ran sweet, now carrying the taste of metal and ash. The very air that drifted from the south seemed heavy with a reek that belonged neither to honest decay nor healthy growth. Saruman, spoke Treebeard at last, and the name fell among them like a stone dropped into still water. The White Wizard, who speaks fair words to the hasty folk, who promises wisdom and brings only hunger. His tower stands within the ring of stone, but his thoughts reach deeper than stone, deeper than root, down into the dark places where the earth remembers its first shaping. The wind shifted, carrying upon it the distant sound of axes biting wood, of saws singing their harsh song through living timber. From the borders came word that the trees were falling, not the careful harvest that woodsmen made in the borders of settled lands, where one tree taken meant 3 planted, but a great felling, a hunger that devoured whole groves and left only stumps bleeding sap into the rain. The wizard has need of timber, murmured Leaflock, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves, but not for halls to house the living, not for ships to bear folk across the waters. This is the hunger of war-making, the thirst of furnaces that burn not for warmth but for the forging of things that should not be forged. In the growing darkness of the wood, other voices joined the council. The last of the horns, those trees that had learned a measure of movement and thought, whose roots could stride like feet when great need arose. They spoke of shadows walking upright where no shadows should be, of voices calling in the black speech that made the leaves curl and blacken on the branch. We must watch, said Treebeard, finally. Watch and remember, for if the darkness spreads, if the poison reaches the heartwood of the forest, then all the green things of Middle-earth may wither before their time, and the world will know only the grey rain falling on the last tree. Section 3. The Lone Rider. Through the grey morning mist that clung to the vales of Eriador, a lone figure rode upon the ancient paths that wound between hill and hollow. Gandalf the Grey sat straight in his saddle, his staff held firm in his weathered hand, while beneath him Shadowfax stepped light as wind upon stone, his hooves making no sound upon the wet earth. The wizard's eyes were troubled, grey as the storm clouds that gathered upon the peaks of the Hitheglir, for the words of the eagles had reached him in the night, and the dreams of the wise had been filled with the sound of grinding stone and the smell of smoke that carried no warmth. Gwaihir had spoken of the blackening waters, and Radagast the Brown had sent word from his halls in Rosgobel of beasts fleeing southward as if driven by some terror they could not name. For 3 days and nights Gandalf had ridden from the quiet paths of the Shire, where the hobbits tended their gardens in blessed ignorance of the wider world's troubles. Behind him lay the round doors and yellow windows of Bag End, where Bilbo Baggins kept safe a certain golden ring, its true nature still hidden beneath the guise of a simple magic trinket. The wizard's heart was heavy with the weight of secrets, but heavier still with the growing certainty that the time of secrets was drawing to an end. The path led him now through the wild lands that lay between the last bridge and the Weather Hills, where the ruins of ancient kingdoms lay buried beneath bracken and thorn. Here the Dunedain rode their long watches, the heirs of Isildur keeping guard over realms that had forgotten their names. From time to time, Gandalf glimpsed the grey shadows of the rangers moving parallel to his course, and knew that word of his passage would reach Aragorn, son of Arathorn, before the sun had set. As the miles fell away beneath Shadowfax's tireless stride, the wizard's thoughts turned to the words that Saruman had spoken at their last meeting in Isengard. The White Wizard had counselled patience, as was his way, speaking of the need to gather more knowledge before action was taken. But there had been something in his voice, a note that rang false as cracked brass, and his eyes had held a light that was not altogether wholesome. "The roots of the matter lie deeper than you suppose, Gandalf," Saruman had said, standing tall in his white robes upon the circle of Orthanc. "There are powers stirring in the world that require a more comprehensive understanding. The ring of which you speak may indeed be what you believe it to be, but there are other rings, other powers, other paths to wisdom than the ones you would walk." Even now, riding through the wild lands beneath the watching stars, Gandalf felt the chill of those words, for he had heard in them an echo of voices that belonged to the darkness, a hunger that spoke not of wisdom, but of dominion. The White Wizard walked upon the edge of a precipice, and the Istari who had been sent to guide the free peoples was becoming something else, something that looked toward the shadow and found it fair. The road rose before him toward the misty mountains, and beyond those peaks lay Mirkwood the Great, where the necromancer had dwelt in Dol Guldur until the White Council had driven him forth. But driven him where? Into what new dwelling? What fresh stronghold from which to spin his webs of malice? The questions burned in Gandalf's mind like brands, and he urged Shadowfax to greater speed, for he sensed that the time for questions was passing, and the hour of answers, bitter though they might be, was close at hand. Section 4. Dol Guldur in the distance. The fortress of Dol Guldur rose from the southern reaches of Mirkwood like a canker upon the green face of the earth, its black towers twisted skyward in mockery of the fair spires that once had crowned the hill of Armen Lanc. From the high passes of the misty mountains, Gandalf could see it, standing dark against the autumn sky, and even at this great distance, the sight of it filled his heart with a cold foreboding. Once, in the elder days, this hill had been fair to look upon, crowned with the silver towers of Gil-galad's people, where the light of Elendil's star had shone forth to guide travellers through the pathless wood. But the darkness had claimed it, making it into a stronghold of shadow where no wholesome thing could grow, and from its dungeons had come such evils as had not walked Middle-earth since the fall of Angband. The White Council had come here in force, their power united against the necromancer who dwelt within those walls. Saruman had led them, his voice raised in words of unmaking, while Galadriel's light had shone like a star of hope, and Elrond's wisdom had guided their steps through the maze of malice that surrounded the hill. They had driven forth the enemy, cleansing the towers of their shadow, and for a time it had seemed that the victory was complete. But Gandalf knew now with the bitter wisdom that comes to those who look too deeply into the dark, that their triumph had been hollow. The necromancer had fled, yes, but not in defeat, in preparation. He had withdrawn to Mordor, to the stronghold of Barad-dûr that awaited his return, and there, in the shadow of Mount Doom, he had begun to gather his strength for the war that was to come. "We were fools," Gandalf murmured to himself as Shadowfax picked his way down the rocky path. "We drove him from his hiding place, thinking ourselves victorious, but we only forced him to reveal himself before he was ready. Now he gathers his armies in the open, and the time of stealth is ended." The trees of Mirkwood whispered in the wind that blew from the south, their voices filled with the memory of corruption. Even now, years after the necromancer's departure, the wood remained sick, its paths twisted and its shadows deeper than they should be. The spiders bred still in the darkest corners, and strange lights danced among the trees at night, leading travelers astray into pools and pits from which there was no return. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Gandalf urged his mount toward the borders of the wood. There were paths here that only the wise knew, roads that led deep into the heart of the forest, where the elven king Thranduil held his halls beneath the hill. If any knew the true state of Dol Guldur, if any could speak of what shadows still lingered in its depths, it would be the wood elves who dwelt closest to its malice. But even as he rode toward the eaves of Mirkwood, Gandalf's thoughts were drawn southward, across the plains of Rohan, to where Isengard stood in its circle of stone. For it seemed to him that there was a connection between these places of shadow, a thread of malice that ran from the ruins of Dol Guldur to the Tower of Orthanc, and at its center sat Saruman the White, weaving patterns that only he could see. The stars came out one by one as night fell over the wildlands, but their light seemed dimmer than it should be, as if some shadow stood between Middle-earth and the clean fire of the heavens. And in that growing darkness, Gandalf felt the weight of the years pressing upon him, and the knowledge that the peace of the Third Age was ending, whether the free peoples willed it or not. Tomorrow, he would seek the halls of the Elven King and learn what news the Wood Elves brought from their long watch upon the borders of shadow. But tonight, he would keep vigil beneath the stars and think upon the paths that led from light into darkness, and wonder if the Astari had failed in their mission before it was complete. Section 5. Into the Black. The gates of Dol Guldur yawned open like the mouth of some vast beast, their iron hinges red with rust and fouled with the drippings of creatures that shunned the light. Gandalf stood upon the threshold, his staff glowing with a pale fire that seemed small and fragile against the weight of darkness that pressed down from the twisted towers above. 3 days had passed since his meeting with King Thranduil in the halls beneath the hill. The Elven King had spoken in measured words of the shadow that still clung to the southern borders of his realm, of patrols that returned with tales of whispers in empty chambers and footsteps in the halls where no feet should walk. "The necromancer is gone," Thranduil had said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "But his passing has left scars upon the very stones, and in those scars other things have made their nests." Now Gandalf walked alone through the ruined courtyards where once the fair folk of Gil-galad had sung beneath the stars. The stones beneath his feet were cracked and blackened, stained with substances that might once have been blood but had long since hardened into something worse. Creeping vines covered the walls, their leaves black as midnight, and their thorns sharp as daggers, and from their twisted stems came a reek like the breath of graves. The silence was complete, more absolute than the quiet of deep caves or the hush of winter snow. It was the silence of death, but death that refused to lie still, death that writhed and whispered in the corners of perception, just beyond the reach of sight and sound. Gandalf's footsteps echoed strangely in this emptiness, as if the sound were being swallowed by hungry mouths that lurked in the shadows. In the central courtyard stood a well, its rim carved with runes that hurt the eye to look upon. The water that lay in its depths was black as ink, and from its surface rose vapors that made the air shimmer like heat haze. This had been the necromancer's scrying pool, where he had looked forth across Middle-earth with eyes like burning coals, seeking always for the thing that he had lost, the precious that had slipped from his grasp in the deeps of time. Gandalf did not approach the well. Even empty of its master's malice, it radiated a wrongness that made his skin crawl and his staff burn brighter in response. Instead, he turned toward the stairs that led up into the central tower, where the greatest secrets of Dol Guldur had been kept. If there were answers to be found in this place of shadow, they would lie in the chambers where the necromancer had worked his will upon the substance of the world. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved from the living rock of the hill, and with each step upward, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. Ancient symbols were graven into the walls, not the fair script of the Eldar, but the black speech of Mordor, words of binding and breaking that made the very air foul to breathe. Cobwebs hung in tatters from the ceiling, but they were not the honest webs of spiders. They were made of some substance that glittered like metal and cut like wire. At the top of the stairs lay a door of black iron, its surface covered with locks and bolts and bars that spoke of things imprisoned rather than things kept out. But the door stood open now, hanging loose upon its hinges, and beyond it lay a chamber that had once been the heart of shadow in the northern world. The room was circular, its walls lined with shelves that had once held books and scrolls and artifacts of power. But the shelves were empty now, swept clean by the wind that blew through the broken windows, and only dust and fragments remained to tell of the knowledge that had been gathered here. In the center of the chamber stood a chair of black stone, its arms carved in the likeness of coiled serpents, and upon its seat lay a single object, a crystal orb dark as midnight, cracked through from top to bottom. Gandalf approached it slowly, his staff held ready, for he knew what this was. A palantir, one of the seeing stones of Númenor, corrupted by the will of the enemy and turned to his purpose. Through this stone, the necromancer had communed with his master in Barad-dûr, and through it, the will of Sauron had reached out to touch the minds of those who dwelt in the light. Section 6. The Captive King. In the deepest dungeon of Dol Guldur, where no light had shone for 900 years, a voice called out from the darkness, faint as the whisper of wind through dry leaves, yet filled with such majesty that even the stones seemed to listen. Gandalf descended the winding stairs that led down into the very roots of the hill, his staff's light casting wild shadows upon the walls where iron chains hung like the ribs of some vast skeleton. The air grew thick and foul as he descended, heavy with the reek of old suffering and the bitter tang of despair. These were the oubliettes, where the necromancer had kept his prisoners, the forgotten souls who had vanished from the world of the living to feed his hunger for knowledge and pain. Most of the cells stood empty now, their doors hanging open upon darkness, but from one came the sound of labored breathing and a voice that spoke in the high tongue of the Noldor. "Who walks in the shadow?" came the whisper. "Who brings light into the place where light was lost? Come closer, bearer of flame, and see what the enemy has made of one who was once mighty among the firstborn." Gandalf approached the barred door and held his staff high, its radiance pushing back the darkness to reveal the figure that lay within. Upon a bed of mouldering straw sat an elf lord of ancient days, his raiment torn and stained, his hair white as winter snow, his eyes dim with the weight of centuries. Yet in his bearing still was something of the light of Valinor, and Gandalf knew him for one of the great among the Noldor, though his name had been lost to the memory of Middle-earth. "I am Gil-galad's kinsman," said the prisoner, and his voice carried echoes of trumpets and the laughter of the undying lands. "I was Celebdil the Fair, master of the hidden ways beneath the mountains, keeper of the secret roads that led from Rivendell to the Grey Havens. But the shadow found me as I walked the high passes, and I was brought here to serve the necromancer's will." The elf's hands were withered, the fingers twisted like the roots of dying trees, and about his wrists were shackles of black iron that seemed to drink the light from Gandalf's staff. "For 900 years I have sat in darkness," Celebdil continued, "and in that time the enemy has sought to break my will and bend my knowledge to his purpose. He would know the secret ways, the hidden paths by which the wise may travel unseen. And though my body has grown weak, my spirit has remained unbroken." Gandalf reached through the bars and touched the ancient shackles, feeling the malice that was wrought into their making. They were not mere bonds of iron, but chains forged with spells of binding, held fast by the will of their creator. Only the necromancer himself could have broken them, or one whose power was equal to his own. "The necromancer is gone," Gandalf said softly, "driven forth by the White Council to the land of his making. But his servants remain, and his works endure. These bonds I cannot break with my own strength, yet perhaps—" He raised his staff, and its light blazed forth like a star, filling the dungeon with radiance that seemed to burn the very air. "Ash Nazg Durbatuluk," cried a voice from the darkness above, speaking in the black speech. "The shadow reaches everywhere, grey fool. You think to undo what the Master has wrought, but his will is stronger than your feeble light." From the stairs came the sound of footsteps, not the heavy tread of orc feet, but the soft padding of something that walked upright, yet was not wholesome. A wraith descended, its form half seen in the shadows, wrapped in tattered robes that had once been white, but were now stained with old blood and fouler things. "I am the Keeper," it hissed, "the guardian of the deep places, the warder of the forgotten. The necromancer set me here to watch over his treasures, and though he has gone forth to greater wars, still I keep his trust. The Elf Lord shall not be freed while shadow endures upon the earth." But Gandalf stood firm, his staff blazing with white fire, and spoke words in the ancient tongue that made the stones ring like bells. The wraith recoiled with a shriek that set the iron chains singing, and in that moment of its weakness, the shackles that bound Celebdil cracked and fell away like dust. Section 7. The Necromancer's Voice. As the shackles crumbled to ash, the very foundations of Dol Guldur trembled, and from the depths of the Black Tower came a sound like thunder rolling beneath the earth. The wraith that stood upon the stairs threw back its hood, revealing a face that was terrible to behold. Not the visage of death, for that at least brings peace, but the countenance of something that refused to die, that clung to the world through malice alone. You meddle with forces beyond your comprehension, Gandalf Stormcrow, the wraith spoke, and its voice was like the hissing of serpents. I am more than the keeper of this place. I am the echo of my master's will, the shadow of his shadow. Though he dwells now in Barad-dûr, his thoughts reach out across the leagues, and through me he speaks. The air in the dungeon grew thick and oppressive, heavy with a presence that seemed to press down upon them like the weight of mountains. Celebdil cowered against the wall of his cell, his ancient strength failing before the malice that filled the darkness. But Gandalf stood firm, his staff burning with a light that would not be quenched. Sauron, Gandalf said, and the name fell among them like a stone cast into still water. You think your voice can reach me here, in this place of your defeat. The White Council drove you forth, scattered your servants, cleansed your corruption from these halls. You have no power here. But the wraith laughed, a sound like glass breaking in the cold, and its eyes burned with a fire that belonged to neither Middle-earth nor the Undying Lands. Do I not? Look around you, Grey Wanderer. See what my presence has wrought, what my will has shaped from the substance of shadow. This place is mine, bought with blood and suffering, paid for with the screams of the innocent. Though my body dwells far hence, my spirit has put forth roots in this soil, and they reach deeper than you know. The walls began to sweat with a moisture that was not water, a black ichor that ran down the stones like tears. The air filled with whispers, not the voices of the living, but the echoes of all who had died in torment within these walls. Their words were in no language spoken by the free peoples, but their meaning was clear: despair, hopelessness, the slow dissolution of all that was fair and good in the world. You think you have saved this elf lord? The wraith continued, gesturing toward Celebdil, who lay gasping upon the mouldering straw. But he has dwelt too long in shadow, breathed too deeply of the air that reeks with my malice. The darkness has touched his heart, and though his body may leave this place, part of him will remain forever in my keeping. Gandalf felt a chill of fear run through him, for he saw that the wraith spoke truth. Though Celebdil's shackles were broken, though his body was free to walk beneath the stars once more, there was a shadow upon his face that had not been there before, a dimming of the light that had once shone in his eyes. The long years of captivity had marked him in ways that time alone could not heal. This is my gift to the world, the voice of the enemy whispered through the wraith's lips. Not the swift destruction of sword and flame, but the slow corruption of all that lives. One by one, the lights of the free peoples shall be dimmed, until at last only darkness remains. Even now, my servants work in secret places, turning friend against friend, sowing seeds of doubt in the hearts of the wise. The wraith's gaze turned toward Gandalf, and in its burning eyes, the wizard saw images that made his heart grow cold. Saruman, the White, standing in the circle of Orthanc, his robes no longer pure, but stained with many colors, the Shire burning beneath a red sky, while orcs marched through the green fields. the towers of Minas Tirith falling one by one into ruin, while the tree of the kings withered and died. "You see truly," the enemy's voice whispered, "the future that awaits if the ring should come to me. But there are other futures, other paths that might be walked. The wise need not stand alone against the gathering storm. There is power in unity, strength in alliance, and the ring could be wielded by one who has the wisdom to use it well." Section 8. Fire in. The darkness. The malice that filled the dungeon pressed upon Gandalf like a living thing, seeking to crush his will and bend his purpose to the enemy's design. But the wizard stood like a pillar of fire in the darkness, his staff blazing with a light that seemed to draw its strength from sources beyond the circles of the world. In that hour, the power that was in him, the flame imperishable that had been his gift from the west, burned bright and clear, pushing back the shadow that sought to overwhelm them all. "No," Gandalf said, and his voice rang like a bell in the stillness. "I have seen the paths you would have me walk, and they lead only to ruin. The ring is not a tool to be wielded by the wise, but a trap laid for the mighty. Its power corrupts all who touch it, turning even the greatest among the valor to madness and despair. I will not be your instrument, Sauron, nor will I suffer this shadow to endure." He raised his staff, and the words of unmaking poured from his lips in the tongue that was spoken before the making of the world. The wraith shrieked and recoiled, its form beginning to fray at the edges like smoke in a strong wind. But still it fought against the light, drawing strength from the malice that was woven into the very stones of Dol Guldur. "You cannot destroy me, Stormcrow," it hissed. "I am part of this place now, rooted in its darkness like a poisonous tree. Strike me down, and I will only return stronger than before." But Gandalf was no longer listening to its words. His mind was focused upon the task at hand, his will bent to the work of cleansing. The light of his staff grew brighter still, until it seemed that a star had fallen from heaven to burn in the depths of the earth. The shadows fled before it like living things, shrieking as they dissolved into nothingness, and the whispers of the dead fell silent at last. Celebdil struggled to his feet, his ancient frame trembling with the effort, but his eyes were clear now. The shadow that had dimmed them burned away by the cleansing fire. "I feel it," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "The darkness is lifting, the weight that has pressed upon my spirit for 9 long centuries. You have done what I thought impossible, Mithrandir. You have brought light into the deepest places of shadow." The wraith made one last desperate effort to maintain its hold upon the world, its form condensing into a shape of pure malice that lunged toward Gandalf with claws that could rend spirit as well as flesh. But the wizard was ready for it. He spoke a single word in the holy tongue, and the creature burst like a bubble, its essence scattered to the winds that blow between the stars. In the sudden silence that followed, Gandalf felt the change that had come over Dol Guldur. The oppressive weight of evil was gone, the air no longer thick with malice and despair. It was still a place of sorrow, marked forever by the suffering that had been endured within its walls, but it was no longer a stronghold of the enemy. The poison had been drawn from the wound, though the scar would remain. "Come," he said to Celebdil, extending his hand to help the ancient elf lord to his feet. The sun shines fair above, and the stars wheel in their courses as they have since the music began. You have been too long in darkness. Let us walk together beneath the sky and speak of hope rather than despair. Together, they climbed the winding stairs that led up from the dungeons, past the empty chambers where shadows no longer lurked, past the courtyard where the black well now lay cracked and dry. At the gates of Dol Guldur they paused, looking back at the twisted towers that rose like broken fingers against the sky. What will become of this place? Celebdil asked. Will it stand empty now, a monument to sorrow? Gandalf was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if he looked upon things that had not yet come to pass. For a time, he said, at last. But the wheel turns, and nothing remains unchanged forever. There will come a day when the towers fall, when the stones are cast down, and the earth reclaims what was taken from it. And in that day, perhaps, something fair may grow again upon this hill, and the memory of darkness will fade like a dream upon waking. Section 9. Return to the Wise. The leaves of Rivendell burned gold and crimson in the light of the setting sun as Gandalf rode through the valley that was hidden from the world, his grey robes travel-stained and his face marked by the shadows he had faced in the depths of Dol Guldur. Beside him rode Celebdil the Fair, no longer the withered prisoner who had languished in darkness, but renewed in strength, though still bearing the marks of his long captivity upon his ancient frame. The sound of water falling echoed through the valley as they crossed the ford of Bruinen, where the waters sang with voices that remembered the music of creation. The very air of Rivendell seemed to wash away the taint of shadow that clung to them, replacing it with the clean scent of growing things and the warm light of stars that shone without malice. In the Hall of Fire, beneath the painted ceiling, where the deeds of elder days were wrought in gold and azure, the White Council had gathered at Gandalf's summons. Elrond sat in his chair of carved oak, his ageless face grave with the weight of the tidings he had already heard in part. Beside him stood Galadriel, fairest of the Noldor, still dwelling in Middle-earth, her hair like a net of gold catching the light of the flames, her eyes deep as the wells of memory that lay beneath the roots of time. Saruman the White sat apart from the others, his back straight and his hands folded upon his staff of office. His robes were pure white as fresh snow, unmarked by travel or toil, and his voice when he spoke was clear and measured, filled with the authority of one who had delved deep into lore and emerged with wisdom. Yet Gandalf, watching him with eyes that had looked upon shadow and recognized its touch, saw something that had not been there before, a tension in the way he held himself, a shadow that passed across his features when he thought himself unobserved. "You have done well, my friend," Saruman said as Gandalf recounted the tale of his journey to Dol Guldur and the cleansing of its darkness. To free one of the firstborn from so long a captivity, to drive out the last echoes of the necromancer's malice. These are deeds worthy of song. Yet I wonder if wisdom might not have counseled a different course. Galadriel's eyes flashed with a light that was not altogether safe, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the music of Valinor, but edged with steel. "What counsel would you offer, Curanir? That we should have left Celebdil to rot in darkness? That we should have suffered the poison of that place to spread unchecked?" "Peace, lady," Saruman replied, raising one pale hand. "I speak not of abandoning the suffering, but of the greater wisdom that sees all ends. The wraith that guarded Dol Guldur, the echo of our enemy's will. It spoke truly when it said that striking down one shadow might cause others to grow stronger. We have cleansed one stronghold, yes, but at what cost? Even now, Sauron knows that his secrets have been discovered, his servants scattered. He will move more swiftly now, gather his strength with greater urgency. Elrond leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes troubled. "You speak of the ring," he said quietly. "The burden that Isildur should have cast into the fires but could not. It stirs, does it not? After long years of silence, it seeks its master once more." Gandalf nodded grimly. "In the black breath that filled Dol Guldur, I felt its presence like a wound in the world. It lies hidden still, lost in the wild lands or the deep places of the earth, but not forgotten. Sauron's servants search for it, and with each passing year, their net grows wider. It is only a matter of time before it is found." Saruman interrupted, his voice smooth as oil upon water. "Yes, that is the heart of the matter. The ring will be found, whether by our enemy or by those who serve the light. The question that should concern us is not whether this will happen, but how we might prepare for it. The ring is a weapon after all, a tool of great power that might be turned against its maker if wielded by one with the wisdom to use it well." The silence that followed his words was heavy with unspoken thoughts and growing fears. Galadriel's hand moved to touch the silver ring that adorned her finger, Vilya, the mightiest of the three. And in her eyes was the memory of the light that had faded from Valinor when the trees were darkened. Section 10. Stirring the North. The wind that blew across the lonely mountain carried with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter's coming. But in the halls of Erebor there burned a fire that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. Thorin Oakenshield sat upon the throne of his fathers, the Arkenstone blazing like a captured star upon his breast, while about him stood the lords and warriors of the dwarves, their axes keen and their beards braided for war. Gandalf had come to them in the grey hour before dawn, bearing word from the White Council and tidings that made even the stout hearts of the Longbeards grow cold. The ring was stirring, the enemy was gathering strength, and in the deep places of the world, old evils were awakening that had slept since the fall of kingdoms. War was coming to Middle-earth, whether the free peoples willed it or not, and all who would stand against the darkness must make ready. "The wizard speaks truly," rumbled Balin, eldest of Thorin's companions, his white beard flowing like water over his coat of mail. "Even here, in the halls our fathers carved from the living rock, we have felt the shadow growing. The ravens bring word from the south, orc bands moving in the misty mountains, wolves gathering in packs such as have not been seen since the fell winter. Something drives them north, something that makes even the beasts of shadow flee in terror." Dane Ironfoot, Lord of the Iron Hills, struck his hammer upon the floor so that sparks flew from the stone. "Let them come," he roared, his voice echoing from the pillared halls. "Let all the spawn of darkness crawl forth from their holes. The axes of the dwarves are sharp, and our shields are strong. We do not flee from shadow. We stand and fight as our fathers did before us." But Thorin was silent, his dark eyes fixed upon something that only he could see. The madness that had taken him during the siege of Erebor was gone, burned away by the dragon fire and the wisdom that comes with near death. but in its place had come a colder understanding, a knowledge of the weight that rested upon the shoulders of kings. "The time for standing alone is past," he said at last, his voice carrying the authority of one who had walked through fire and emerged tempered like steel. "In the dark days of old, when Smaug first came to the mountain, we fought alone and were scattered to the winds. Our kingdom fell, our people wandered in exile, and the treasures of our fathers lay unguarded in the darkness. I will not see that fate befall us again." Gandalf leaned forward, his grey eyes bright with hope. "Then you will answer the call when it comes? When the beacons are lit and the horn of war is sounded, the dwarves of Erebor will march." "More than that," Thorin replied, rising from his throne with the Arkenstone blazing upon his breast. "We will not wait for the call. We will send it forth ourselves. Let word go out to all the kindreds of the dwarves, to the folk of the Blue Mountains and the Grey Mountains, to the hidden halls where Durin's children still delve and build. Let them know that Thorin Oakenshield calls them to council, that the king under the mountain has need of their strength." In the days that followed, ravens flew forth from Erebor like a dark cloud, bearing messages sealed with the sign of the mountain and the oak leaf crown. To Dain in the Iron Hills went word of the growing shadow, and with it a call to ready his warriors for battles yet to come. To the Blue Mountains went summons for the Greybeards who remembered the fall of Moria, who had witnessed the last stand of Balin's folk in the darkness of Khazad-dûm. But it was not only to his own people that Thorin sent word. Messages went also to Lake Town, where Bard the Bowman ruled as King of Dale, calling upon the ancient friendship between their peoples and the bonds forged in the fire of Smaug's defeat. To the Woodland realm went formal words of alliance, setting aside old grievances for the sake of the greater battle that was to come. And strangest of all, deep in the night, when the stars shone cold above the mountain, Thorin himself took up his pen and wrote with his own hand a letter that bore no royal seal, addressed to a small hole in the ground, far to the west, where a certain burglar kept his pantry well stocked and his doorstep painted green. "Master Baggins," the letter began, in the careful script that Thorin had learned in the halls of his exile. "The world grows dark, and I have need of friends who can walk quietly in shadows, who can find things that are lost and lose things that should not be found." Section 11. A hobbit remembered. The autumn sun slanted golden through the windows of Bag End, casting dancing patterns of light across the well-appointed parlour where Bilbo Baggins sat in his favourite chair, a cup of tea growing cold at his elbow, and a letter bearing the royal seal of Erebor spread open upon his lap. The words upon the parchment seemed to shimmer before his eyes, not with any magic save that of memory, and in their formal phrases he heard once again the voice of Thorin Oakenshield calling across the years. "Dear me," Bilbo murmured to himself, adjusting his spectacles and reading the letter for the third time. "Kings and battles and gatherings of war. Whatever happened to the quiet life I was promised after all that business with the dragon?" Yet even as he spoke the words, his fingers strayed unconsciously to the gold ring that hung upon its chain beneath his waistcoat, the ring he had found in the dark tunnels below the misty mountains, the ring that had made him invisible to the eyes of enemies and helped him rescue his companions from the spiders and the dungeons of the wood elves. Such a simple thing it seemed, smooth and golden and quite ordinary. Yet sometimes, in the deep watches of the night, he fancied he could hear it whispering, calling out in a voice too faint to understand, but too insistent to ignore. The sound of footsteps upon the garden path drew his attention from the letter, and a moment later came the familiar rat-a-tat-tat of Gandalf's staff upon his green door. Bilbo rose from his chair with a sigh that was half relief and half trepidation. For though he was always glad to see the wizard, Gandalf's visits had a way of leading to unexpected journeys and uncomfortable adventures. "My dear Gandalf," Bilbo said as he opened the door, "how perfectly dreadful to see you again. I was just reading this most alarming letter from Thorin, all about kings and councils and the gathering of armies. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Gandalf smiled, but Bilbo could see the weight of care that rested upon the wizard's shoulders, the lines of weariness that had not been there when they had parted at the gates of Erebor those many years ago. "I might know a thing or two," Gandalf admitted, settling himself into the chair that Bilbo had long since come to think of as the wizard's chair, though he had never said so aloud. "The world has grown darker since our last meeting, my dear fellow. Darker and more dangerous than even the fires of Smaug's wrath." Over tea and seed cake, Gandalf spoke of his journey to Dol Guldur, of the shadow that had stirred in Isengard, of the growing certainty that the peace of the Shire could not last forever. He spoke carefully, watching Bilbo's face for signs of understanding, but he did not speak of the ring. Not yet, not until he was certain of what lay hidden beneath the hobbit's seemingly innocent questions. "The thing is, Bilbo," Gandalf said at last, setting down his cup with the air of one who approaches a subject of great delicacy, "there are certain artifacts that have been lost over the years, things that might prove dangerous if they fell into the wrong hands. I don't suppose you've come across anything of that nature in your travels, anything that might seem magical or powerful or precious." Bilbo's hand moved involuntarily toward his waistcoat, then stopped as if caught in the act of some guilty secret. For a moment, his face wore an expression that Gandalf had never seen before, a look of hunger and possessiveness that sat strangely upon his kindly features, like a shadow passing across the sun. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Bilbo said, his voice carefully light. "I brought back nothing from the mountain but my 14th share of the treasure, and precious little that was, all things considered. A few trinkets, nothing more, nothing important, certainly nothing magical." But even as he spoke, his fingers closed around the chain that hung about his neck, and Gandalf felt a chill of recognition run through him like winter wind. The ring was here, in this room, hanging perhaps within arm's reach of where he sat. The ring that Isildur should have destroyed, the ring that Sauron sought with all his malice, was hidden in the parlor of a hobbit hole, guarded by nothing more than green paint and a round door. "Of course not," Gandalf said quietly, his grey eyes never leaving Bilbo's face. "Forgive an old fool his wandering thoughts. The road grows long, and sometimes I imagine dangers where none exist. Still, if you should ever come across anything unusual, anything that makes you feel different, when you hold it, I hope you will remember that I am your friend, and friends should share their burdens as well as their joys." Section 12. The plan set in motion. In the deep halls of Khazad-dûm, where the shadow had not yet fallen, and the fires of the dwarves burned bright in the depths. Balin, son of Fundin, walked the ancient ways that his people had carved from the living stone. The pillars rose about him like the trunks of great trees, their capitals wrought in the likeness of leaves and flowers that bloomed eternal in the darkness. While overhead, the roof was lost in shadows that seemed to stretch up to the very roots of the mountains. But Balin's thoughts were not upon the beauty of his surroundings, nor upon the wealth of mithril that still lay hidden in the veins of the rock. His mind was filled with the words that Gandalf had spoken in the halls of Erebor, with the growing certainty that the time of peace was ending and the hour of war drew near. In his hands he carried a map, not one of the crude sketches that marked the borders of kingdoms or the courses of rivers, but a chart of the deep ways, the secret paths that ran beneath the mountains, like veins of silver in the dark. This was the map that Thor had carried with him into exile, the map that had led Thorin and his companions to the secret door of Erebor and the halls where Smaug kept his hoard. But there were other markings upon it, other paths and passages that led to places the dragon had never seen, chambers where the greatest treasures of the dwarves lay hidden from the greed of enemies and the malice of time. The Arkenstone was not the only wonder that our fathers wrought, Balin murmured to himself as he traced the ancient runes with one gnarled finger. There are weapons here, armor forged in the fires of creation, tools of power that have slept too long in the darkness. If war is coming, if the shadow spreads across the world, then we must be ready to meet it with steel and fire. Deep in the treasure vaults of Erebor, where the gold of kings lay heaped like autumn leaves, other preparations were already underway. Thorin had called for the ancient arms to be brought forth from their hiding places, the weapons that had been carried in the War of the Last Alliance and the battle before the Black Gate. Swords of star steel emerged from their wrappings, their edges keen as the day they were forged, while axes that had hewn the heads from orcs in the shadow of Mount Doom were polished until they gleamed like captured starlight. But it was not only weapons that the dwarves prepared. In the great forges where the ring of power might have been unmade, if only Isildur had possessed the will, the smiths worked day and night to craft new armor, new blades, new tools of war. The fires burned higher than they had since the kingdom's return, and the sound of hammers rang through the halls like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Ravens flew forth each day bearing messages to the scattered kindreds of the dwarves, and each day brought new replies, some written in the careful script of scribes, others carved in runes upon plates of stone or metal. From the Iron Hills came word that Dane was gathering his warriors, sharpening his spears and preparing for the march. From the Blue Mountains came promises of aid, though the numbers would be few, for many of Durin's folk had been lost in the fall of Moria and the long years of exile, and from places whose names were whispered only in the deepest halls, where the eldest of the dwarves remembered the glory of the First Age, came other words that spoke of treasures hidden since the fall of Nogrod and Belegost, of weapons forged in the fires of the earth before the light of the trees was darkened. The Longbeards were stirring, the Firebeards were sharpening their axes, and in the distant halls where few dared to walk, the Stonefoots and the Blacklocks were making ready for war. But strangest of all the messages that flew forth from Erebor was the one that bore no royal seal. the letter written in Thorin's own hand and addressed to a green door in the Shire. For in that letter lay the seed of a plan so desperate and so dangerous that even the king under the mountain had hesitated before setting pen to paper, a plan that would set in motion the events that would reshape the world, for good or ill, before the turning of another age. The letter was brief, its words chosen with the care that comes to those who know the weight of kingship. But in its formal phrases lay an invitation that would change the course of history, though neither the sender nor the receiver could have guessed it at the time. An invitation to adventure, to danger, to a journey that would lead through darkness to light, or perhaps to a doom that would swallow all the free peoples in shadow. Section 13. The fire awakens. Deep beneath the lonely mountain, in chambers that had echoed with silence since the coming of the dragon, something stirred in the darkness. The gold that had been Smaug's bed still bore the imprint of his vast form, and among the scattered coins and precious things, there lingered a heat that had nothing to do with the forges of the dwarves. For the fire that had burned within the dragon's heart was not entirely quenched with his death, and in the deepest vaults where his treasure had lain thickest, that fire smouldered still. Thorin felt it as he walked the recovered halls of his fathers, a warmth that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath his feet. At first, he had thought it no more than the natural heat of the mountain's heart, the slow burning of the earth's bones that gives life to the deep places of the world. But as the days passed and the preparations for war grew more urgent, the heat grew stronger, until even the stoutest of his warriors spoke of it in hushed voices. "There is something beneath us," Dwalin reported, his scarred hands resting upon the haft of his great axe. "Something that sleeps but does not die, something that dreams of fire and gold and the taste of burned flesh. The lads who work the deepest mines come up with their faces pale and their eyes wide, speaking of voices in the darkness and the sound of great wings beating in chambers that have no sky." But it was not only in Erebor that the fire was stirring. Far to the south, in the desolation that stretched before the black gate of Mordor, Mount Doom belched forth fresh smoke and flame, its fires burning brighter than they had since the forging of the ring. The very earth trembled with the force of its awakening, and the orcs that dwelt in the shadow of Barad-dûr cowered in their holes as the mountain's voice roared across the wasteland. Sauron stood upon the pinnacle of his dark tower, his form wreathed in shadow and flame, and felt the answering fire that burned in distant Erebor. The connection was faint, a thread of power that stretched across the leagues like a spider's web glittering with dew, but it was there nonetheless, a bond forged in the ancient days when the dragons were the children of his malice and the servants of his will. "Smaug is dead," the Dark Lord spoke, his voice like the grinding of millstones in the depths of the earth. "But death is not the end for those who have drunk deeply of the flame that burns eternal. His fire lives on, waiting to be kindled anew, waiting for the hand that knows the words of awakening." In the fortress of Isengard, Saruman the White stood within the circle of Orthanc and felt the stirring too. His pale hands moved in patterns that belonged to no wholesome magic, and his voice spoke words in the black speech that made the very air shiver with malice. For he had delved deep into the lore of dragons in his years of study, had learned the secrets of their making and the words of their binding, and now he sought to turn that knowledge to his own purpose. The fires that burned in the great furnaces beneath Isengard roared higher as he spoke, and in their depths, shapes began to form. Not the honest shapes of iron and steel, but things that writhed and twisted like living flame. The Uruk-hai that labored in the pits below looked up with fear in their yellow eyes, for they sensed that their master was attempting something that even they, in their twisted existence, recognized as an abomination. "Let the fire wake," Saruman whispered, his voice carrying across the miles to where the heat still smoldered in the depths of Erebor. "Let it remember the taste of gold and the hunger for dominion. Let it know that its master calls, that the time of sleeping is ended, and the hour of burning has come." The mountain trembled, and in the deepest vaults of the dwarves, the temperature rose until even the hardiest among them could not long endure it. Strange lights danced among the piles of treasure, not the warm glow of gold in firelight, but something colder and more terrible, the pale radiance of dragon fire awakening from its long slumber. And in that fire, if the tales of the wise are true, something took shape. Not Smaug returned to life, for death had claimed even his proud spirit, but something else, something born from the marriage of his flame and the will of those who would see the world burn. A shadow of the great dragon, a wraith of fire and malice that hungered for the gold that had been its bed and the mountain that had been its lair. The fire was awakening, and with it came a hunger that could never be satisfied, a rage that would burn until all the world lay in ashes beneath its wings. Section 14. A blade, not yet drawn. In the armories of Minas Tirith, where the weapons of the Dunedain lay ranked in silent rows, like soldiers awaiting the call to battle, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, stood before a blade that had not been drawn in 700 years. Anduril it was named, Flame of the West, the sword that had been broken at the feet of Mount Doom and reforged in the fires of hope and desperate need. Its scabbard was plain, wrought of simple leather and steel, but the blade within burned with a light that belonged to the elder days. "The time draws near," the ranger murmured, his weathered hand resting upon the sword's hilt, but not yet drawing it forth. "I can feel it in the turning of the seasons, in the flight of birds and the whispers of the wind. The darkness gathers its strength, and the free peoples must make ready for the storm that is to come." Beside him stood Boromir of Gondor, his face grave with the weight of tidings that had come from the south. "The border grows thin," he said, his voice heavy with weariness. "Each day brings new reports of raids upon our outposts, of orcs moving in greater numbers than we have seen since the days of my grandfather's youth. Osgiliath is besieged again, though not openly. It is a siege of shadows and sudden strikes, of forces that appear and vanish like smoke in the wind. Through the tall windows of the citadel, the two men could see the great river flowing toward the sea, its waters dark with the approach of winter. But it was not the change of seasons that troubled them. It was the knowledge that upon those waters would soon come ships bearing black sails, that from the harbours of Umbar and the havens of the corsairs would issue forth a fleet to match the armies that march from Mordor. "My father grows old," Boromir continued, his eyes fixed upon the distant horizon. "The burden of the ruling stewardship weighs heavy upon him, and each day he spends longer in the Tower of Guard, gazing into the Palantir and seeking counsel from stones that may no longer be trustworthy. I fear that the seeing stone shows him only despair, only the vast armies of the enemy and the certainty of defeat. Aragorn's hand tightened upon Anduril's hilt, and for a moment the blade stirred in its sheath as if eager to taste the air once more. "The stones of Numenor are not evil in themselves," he said quietly, "but they can be turned to the enemy's purpose, twisted to show only the darkness and hide the light. Your father is wise to seek knowledge, but wisdom lies also in knowing when to close one's eyes and trust to hope rather than sight." In the streets below, the people of Minas Tirith went about their daily business, buying and selling in the markets, tending their shops and taverns, caring for their children and their gardens. They knew that war was coming. The rumors could not be hidden forever, and the sight of weapons being sharpened and armor being mended told its own tale. But they clung to their routines as drowning men cling to wreckage, hoping that if they acted as if nothing had changed, perhaps nothing would. Yet even among the common folk, there were signs of the growing shadow. Children woke crying from dreams of darkness, horses shied at shadows that held no threat, and the old women who sold flowers in the market square spoke of willows, weeping black tears, and roses that bloomed with petals the color of dried blood. "There is word from the north," Aragorn said, drawing forth a letter that bore the seal of Rivendell. "Elrond has called a council, a gathering of all who would stand against the darkness. Representatives of every free people are to attend, men and elves, dwarves, and others. The time for secrets is ending, Boromir. The time for half measures and hidden wars is done." The son of Denethor looked up sharply, hope and fear warring in his grey eyes. "A council? To what purpose? Surely you do not think that words alone can turn aside the armies of Mordor, that fair speech can unmake the will of Sauron?" "Not words alone," Aragorn replied, his hand moving once more to the sword at his side. "But there are powers in the world that have slept too long, weapons that have been kept hidden against the day of greatest need. The time has come to bring them forth, to stand in the light rather than lurking in shadow. The time has come for the king to return." As if in response to his words, Anduril sang softly in its sheath, a sound like wind through steel that carried echoes of the music that had shaped the world. And in that singing, both men heard the voice of hope calling across the dark years, reminding them that even in the deepest shadow, the light endures, waiting to be kindled into flame once more. Section 15. The Kingdom Reclaimed. The banners of Erebor flew proud in the mountain wind, their golden harps and silver hammers blazing against the azure sky, while from the great gate of the kingdom came the sound of horns calling across the valley. The army of the dwarves stood arrayed upon the slopes of the lonely mountain, their mail bright as starlight, and their axes keen as winter frost, ready to march forth to the aid of their allies in the war that was to come. Thorin Oakenshield stood at their head, the Arkenstone blazing upon his breast like a captured star, his ancient sword, Orcrist, gleaming at his side. Around him were gathered the lords of his house, Dane Ironfoot with his warriors from the Iron Hills, Balin the wise with his knowledge of the deep roads, Dwalin the strong with his axe that had never known defeat. The flower of the dwarves was there, the last heroes of a people who had endured exile and dragonfire and emerged unbroken. But it was not only the children of Durin who answered the call. From the blue mountains had come the greybeards, who remembered the fall of the Western kingdoms, their beards white with age, but their arms still strong to wield hammer and blade. From the distant halls of the Firebeards and the Broadbeams had come others, bearing weapons forged in the deep places where the earth's fire burns eternal. "My kinsman," Thorin called out, his voice carrying across the assembled host like the ring of steel on stone. The darkness gathers in the south, and the free peoples call for aid. Too long have we dwelt apart, keeping to our halls and our forges while the world above burns with war, but no more. The time has come for the children of Auli to take their place in the great battle, to stand beside elf and man and all who would see the light endure. The cheer that rose from the throats of the dwarves echoed from the peaks like thunder, a sound of defiance that carried across the valley to where the ravens wheeled in the grey sky. But even as they shouted their approval, there were some among them who looked back toward the mountain with troubled eyes, for in the deep places the fire still burned, and strange dreams had begun to visit those who slept too close to the ancient vaults. Balin approached the throne where Thorin sat, his white beard flowing like water over his coat of mail. "My lord," he said quietly, so that only the king might hear, "there is still the matter of the deep fire, the heat that rises from the dragon's hoard. Some of the lads refuse to work the lower mines, speaking of voices in the darkness and the sound of wings where no wings should be." Thorin's hand moved unconsciously to the Arkenstone upon his breast, and for a moment his eyes seemed to reflect its light with an intensity that was not altogether wholesome. "The fire is contained," he said firmly. "Whatever dreams may trouble the sleep of weaklings, the mountain is secure. Our enemies will find no allies in the darkness beneath Erebor." But even as he spoke the words, Thorin felt a chill of doubt in his heart. The heat that rose from the deep places was growing stronger each day, and with it came whispers that spoke in the ancient tongue of dragons, words of fire and gold, and the endless hunger that consumed all things. Sometimes, in the depths of the night, he fancied he could hear the sound of great wings beating in chambers that had no sky, and the echo of laughter that belonged to no living throat. The army began its march as the sun reached its zenith, the long column winding down from the mountain like a river of steel and iron. At their head rode Thorin upon his war pony, the Arkenstone casting rainbows in the clear air, while behind him came the banners of all the kindreds of the dwarves. They sang as they marched the ancient songs of their people that told of the halls of Khazad-dûm and the forging of the seven rings, of the deep roads and the mithril veins, and the fires that burned in the heart of the world. But for all their brave songs and bright banners, there were those among the wise who watched their passing with heavy hearts, for they knew that the fire in the deep places of Erebor was not contained, that it grew stronger with each day that passed, and that someday it would break free to burn across the world like a second sun rising in the darkness. The kingdom was reclaimed, the army was marching, and the dwarves rode forth to war with hope in their hearts and steel in their hands. But behind them, in the depths of the mountain, the fire waited and whispered and dreamed of the day when it would wake fully and all the world would burn beneath its wings. Section 16. A Ring Still Sleeps. In the quiet parlour of Bag End, where the afternoon sun slanted golden through the round windows and the kettle sang soft upon the hob, Bilbo Baggins sat in his favourite armchair with his feet up on a footstool and a book open upon his lap. The pages were filled with his own careful script, the record of adventures that had carried him far from the Shire to the halls of the Elven King and the desolation of Smaug. But his eyes were not upon the words he had written. Instead, his fingers moved restlessly to touch the chain that hung about his neck, feeling the smooth weight of the ring that rested hidden beneath his waistcoat. It had been weeks since Gandalf's last visit, weeks since that uncomfortable conversation about magical artifacts and things that might prove dangerous in the wrong hands. The wizard's questions had troubled Bilbo's sleep, filling his dreams with images of eyes like burning coals and voices that whispered in languages he did not understand. But when he woke, the ring was still there, cool and comforting against his skin, and the fears of the night seemed no more than foolishness brought on by too much cheese before bed. Yet lately there had been changes, subtle alterations in the world around him that spoke of powers stirring beyond the borders of the Shire. The weather had grown strange, with winds that blew from no earthly direction and rains that fell upward toward the sky. The animals that dwelt in the wild lands between Hobbiton and the Old Forest had begun to flee northward, their eyes wide with terror, as if they sensed some approaching doom that mortal senses could not perceive. Even the hobbits, usually content to concern themselves with matters of seed and harvest, pipeweed and ale, had begun to speak in hushed voices of dark shapes moving in the night and lights that danced in the sky where no stars should shine. The Bree-folk who came through on their way to market brought tales of rangers riding hard upon urgent business, of strange folk travelling the roads who spoke in whispers and paid for their lodging with gold that was old beyond the memory of living men. But it was in his dreams that Bilbo felt the change most strongly. Night after night, he found himself walking paths that led through darkness to a great eye of flame, felt himself drawn by a will that was not his own toward a destiny that filled him with both longing and terror. The ring upon his breast grew warm in those dreams, pulsing like a second heart, and always there was a voice calling to him across the void, a voice that spoke of power and dominion and the fulfillment of every desire. "My precious," the voice would whisper, and in the speaking of those words, Bilbo felt a joy so intense it was almost pain. "Come home to me, my love, my precious thing. Come home to the fires where you were born, where you belong, where you will be safe forever in the darkness." He would wake from these dreams with tears upon his cheeks and a hunger in his heart that could not be satisfied by any earthly food. The ring called to him constantly now, its whispers growing stronger with each passing day, and sometimes he found himself walking the roads of the Shire at night, his feet carrying him eastward toward the wild lands, though he could not remember deciding to leave his comfortable hobbit hole. "It is only a ring," he would tell himself in the grey hours before dawn, sitting by his fire with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. "A simple band of gold, nothing more. Whatever dreams may trouble my sleep, whatever fancies fill my waking hours, it is only a ring, and I am master of it, not the other way round." But even as he spoke the words, his fingers would tighten upon the chain about his neck, and in his heart he knew that they were lies. The ring was more than gold, more than metal and craft and the skill of ancient smiths. It was alive in some terrible way, possessed of a will and a purpose that reached across the centuries like the shadow of a great wing, and with each day that passed, it grew stronger while he grew weaker. In the distance, beyond the borders of the Shire, the forces of darkness were gathering for the war that would decide the fate of Middle-earth. But here, in the quiet of Bag End, another battle was being fought. A battle for the soul of a simple hobbit who had stumbled upon the greatest treasure and the most terrible burden in all the world. The ring still slept, but its dreams were deep and dark and filled with fire. Epilogue. Hope in ashes. The last light of day faded from the western sky as Gandalf stood upon the pinnacle of Dol Guldur, his grey robe stirring in the wind that blew from the depths of Mirkwood. Below him lay the ruins of the fortress, its towers broken and its walls cast down, while all around the forest stretched green and fair beneath the rising stars. The malice that had dwelt here was gone at last, driven out by the united strength of the White Council. But the wizard's heart was heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. "It is finished," Galadriel said softly, her voice carrying the music of distant bells as she climbed the winding stair to join him. The Lady of Lorien bore Nenya upon her hand, the ring of water gleaming like captured starlight, and her hair flowed about her shoulders like a river of gold. The necromancer is driven forth, his servants scattered, his stronghold cast down. The shadow that has lain upon the forest for so many years is lifted. But Gandalf shook his head, his grey eyes fixed upon the southern horizon, where the peaks of the Ephel Dúth rose like broken teeth against the sky. One shadow is lifted, but another falls. We have won a victory here, yes, but at a cost we do not yet understand. In driving him from this place, we have forced our enemy to reveal himself before he was ready. The game is in the open now, and all the pieces are in motion. Behind them came Saruman the White, his robes unstained by travel or battle, his staff gleaming like polished silver in the starlight. "You speak as if this were a defeat rather than a triumph," he said, his voice smooth as oil upon water. "The greatest stronghold of the enemy in the north is broken, his plans disrupted, his power diminished. Surely this is cause for celebration rather than sorrow. Is it?" Gandalf turned to face his fellow wizard, and in his eyes was a light that was not altogether trusting. Or have we merely driven a snake from one hole to another, where it may breed and multiply in darkness? The necromancer was content to work in secret here, gathering his strength slowly and carefully. Now he will be forced to act more swiftly, more openly. The war we have long dreaded is at hand. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of growing things and the promise of spring's return to the wounded forest. In the distance, a nightingale began to sing, its voice pure and clear in the darkness, and for a moment, the three who stood upon the ruined tower felt a touch of the peace that had dwelt in Middle-earth before the coming of shadow. "There is hope still," Galadriel said at last, her hand moving to touch the ring upon her finger. "As long as the light endures, as long as there are those willing to stand against the darkness, hope remains. The small hands that are not mentioned in the songs may yet prove mighty enough to turn the tide of war." In the days that followed, the members of the White Council would part and go their separate ways, Elrond to his hidden valley, Galadriel to her golden wood, Saruman to his tower of black stone. The peace of the Third Age was ending, and the time of choices was at hand. Some would choose wisely, others would be led astray by pride and the desire for power, but all would play their part in the great tale that was beginning to unfold. And in a hole in the ground in the Shire, a hobbit would sit by his fire with a ring upon a chain, feeling the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a mantle he had never asked to wear. The ring was stirring from its long sleep. The necromancer was gathering his armies in Mordor, and the time was coming when the smallest of the free peoples would be called upon to bear the greatest burden. The poisoned wells of Isengard would soon run black with malice. The forges of Orthanc would ring with the hammering of weapons, and the White Wizard would cast aside his robes to reveal the colours of the enemy beneath. But that is a tale for another telling, a song for another singer to weave from the threads of hope and despair that bind all tales together. For now, it was enough that the shadow had been driven back, that the stars shone clear above the cleansed forest, and that somewhere in the distance a hobbit was brewing tea and thinking of nothing more dangerous than his next meal. The wells were poisoned, but not all of them. The fire was awakening, but it had not yet burst into flame. And in the space between the ending of one age and the beginning of another, there was still time for hope, still room for the small and overlooked to rise and change the course of history. The greatest tales often begin in the humblest places, with the smallest hands carrying the heaviest burdens. And in the turning of the wheel of time, it is not always the mighty who determine the fate of the world. Sometimes it is the gardeners,